The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace. James Mitchell stood at his post, his posture perfect, his eyes scanning the grounds with practiced vigilance. After 12 years of service in the Royal Guard, this routine had become second nature to him. The crisp autumn air filled his lungs as he breathed steadily, his red uniform immaculate. Every button polished to perfection. James had always dreamed of serving the crown. As a young boy growing up in a small village outside London, he would watch the changing of the guard on television, mesmerized by the discipline and honor it represented. His father, a factory worker, had smiled at his son's ambitions, never discouraging the dream that seemed so far beyond their humble means. Through determination and years of rigorous training, James had achieved what many thought impossible for someone from his background. Today was supposed to be like any other day. The schedule was clear in his mind. Queen Camilla would be attending a charity event in the afternoon, and the security detail had been briefed multiple times. James took pride in his work, knowing that every member of the royal family depended on guards like him to ensure their safety and privacy. It was not just a job. It was a calling, a purpose that gave meaning to his existence. At precisely 9 a.m, the palace began to stir with its usual controlled chaos. Staff members moved with quiet efficiency, preparing for the day ahead. James exchanged brief nods with fellow guards, their silent communication speaking volumes about the camaraderie they shared. These men and women were more than colleagues. They were brothers and sisters in service, bound by loyalty and mutual respect. The first sign that something was different came when James noticed increased activity near the Queen's private quarters. Senior officials were moving with unusual urgency, their faces grave and concerned. James maintained his position, but his trained eye picked up on the subtle changes in atmosphere. Something had happened, though he could not yet determine what. Commander Richard Stone, head of palace security, emerged from a side entrance, his expression unreadable. James had known the commander for years and had always respected his fairness and dedication. Stone had been the one who recommended James for several prestigious assignments. Recognizing his commitment and reliability, their relationship was built on professional trust, making what was about to unfold even more devastating. As midday approached, James was summoned to the security office. The request was unusual but not unprecedented. Sometimes guards were called in for briefings or updates on protocol changes. He straightened his uniform and made his way through the familiar corridors, his mind reviewing his recent performance, finding nothing that would warrant concern. His record was spotless, his dedication unwavering. The security office was different today. The usual hum of activity was replaced by an uncomfortable silence. Several senior staff members were present, their faces betraying nothing. Commander Stone stood behind his desk, and for the first time in their acquaintance, he would not meet James's eyes directly. The air felt heavy, charged with unspoken tension that made James's heart begin to race despite his training. Before any words were spoken, the door opened again, and Queen Camilla herself entered the room. This was highly irregular. Members of the royal family rarely involved themselves directly in security matters. The Queen's presence meant this was something significant, something that required her personal attention. James immediately stood at attention, his training overriding his confusion. Queen Camilla looked tired, her usual composed demeanor slightly strained. She had always been known for her dedication to duty and her careful attention to matters of protocol and security. James had served during several of her engagements and had always found her to be gracious, though distant in the way royalty must be. He had no reason to expect that this encounter would be any different from their previous brief interactions. The Queen's eyes swept the room before settling on James. There was something in her expression that he could not quite read. Determination, perhaps, or regret. She clasped her hands in front of her, a gesture that seemed both regal and somehow vulnerable. The silence stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity as everyone waited for her to speak. Commander Stone finally broke the silence, his voice formal and carefully neutral. He explained that there had been a security incident the previous evening. James's mind raced, trying to recall anything unusual from his shift. He had been on duty until 8, and everything had proceeded according to standard protocol. There had been no breaches, no irregularities that he was aware of. Yet the gravity of the situation suggested otherwise. The commander continued, outlining details that seemed disconnected from James's experience. Apparently, there had been a breach of protocol, a lapse in security that had put the royal family at potential risk. The investigation had been swift and thorough. Evidence had been gathered, witnesses interviewed, and somehow, impossibly, all signs pointed to James as the source of the security failure. His stomach dropped as he began to understand the purpose of this meeting. His career, his life's work, everything he had built was about to crumble. James felt his world tilting as Commander Stone laid out the accusations. A photographer had somehow gained unauthorized access to a restricted area during a private family gathering the previous evening. The breach had been discovered only after the individual was spotted by another security officer. The investigation revealed that the access point had been compromised during James's shift rotation, specifically during a 15-minute window when he was responsible for monitoring the east entrance. The photographs taken during that breach were now circulating among tabloid editors, though palace lawyers had managed to prevent their publication through emergency injunctions. The images showed private family moments that were never meant for public consumption. The violation felt personal, intrusive in a way that transcended normal security concerns. Someone had weaponized those images, and the palace needed to respond decisively. James tried to speak, to defend himself, to explain that he had never left his post, that he had followed every protocol precisely. His voice came out hoarse, almost pleading. He had checked that entrance multiple times during his shift. The security logs would show his diligence. There had to be some mistake, some misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a simple review of the surveillance footage. Commander Stone's expression remained neutral as he explained that the surveillance system had experienced a technical malfunction during that exact time frame. The footage was corrupted, unrecoverable. It was an unfortunate coincidence that only deepened the suspicion. Without video evidence to support his account, James's testimony stood alone against a damning pattern of circumstantial evidence. The locks showed signs of being compromised using security codes that only a limited number of personnel possessed. Queen Camilla listened to this exchange in silence, her face a mask of royal composure. She understood the implications better than anyone. The monarchy's relationship with the press had always been complicated, often hostile. Privacy was a luxury they could rarely afford, but within the palace walls there had always been sanctity. This breach represented a fundamental violation of that last refuge. Someone had betrayed their trust, and the consequences needed to be severe enough to prevent future incidents. The investigation had uncovered something else, something that cast an even darker shadow over James. Bank records showed a deposit into his account 2 days before the incident, £20,000, transferred from an offshore account that investigators traced back to a network known for paying sources inside prestigious institutions. The money had appeared without explanation, without any legitimate source that James could immediately identify. James staggered backward as if physically struck. £20,000. He had no knowledge of any such deposit. His bank account had always been modest, reflecting his civil servant salary. He paid his bills, supported his aging mother, and saved what little he could. There was no luxury in his life, no unexplained wealth that would suggest involvement in something so sordid. This had to be a setup, an elaborate frame that he could not yet understand. The Queen finally spoke, her voice carrying the weight of generations of royal authority. She expressed her disappointment, not with anger but with a sadness that seemed to fill the room. The Royal Guard represented the finest traditions of service and honor. Any betrayal of that trust was unacceptable. The institution itself was at stake, and she could not allow personal considerations to compromise the security of her family. The decision had to be made swiftly and publicly, to send a clear message. James wanted to protest, to demand a proper investigation, to insist on his innocence. But years of training in deference and protocol held him frozen. You did not argue with the Queen. You did not challenge royal decisions even when those decisions seemed manifestly unjust. The hierarchy was absolute, and his position at the bottom of that hierarchy meant his voice carried no weight against such overwhelming institutional power. Commander Stone placed a document on the desk. It was a termination notice already prepared, requiring only James's signature to acknowledge receipt. The language was formal, clinical in its efficiency. Effective immediately, his services were no longer required. His security clearances would be revoked. His access to palace grounds terminated. The pension he had been building for 12 years would be forfeit under the breach of trust clauses in his contract. Everything he had worked for was being swept away in a matter of minutes. The other staff members in the room avoided eye contact. They had worked alongside James for years, had shared meals and stories and the unique bond that came from serving together. Yet now they stood silent, unwilling or unable to speak in his defense. Perhaps they believed the evidence. Perhaps they feared being associated with someone accused of such a serious breach. Or perhaps they simply recognized the futility of challenging a decision that had already been made at the highest levels. Queen Camilla's eyes met James's for a long moment. There was something in that gaze that he could not quite interpret. Regret, certainty, the emotional distance required of her position. She nodded to Commander Stone, a slight but definitive gesture that sealed James's fate. The commander straightened, cleared his throat, and spoke the words that would echo in James's mind for days to come. The formal dismissal was read aloud. James Mitchell was hereby relieved of his duties, effective immediately. He was to surrender his credentials, his uniform, and any palace property in his possession. An escort would accompany him to collect his personal belongings. He was instructed not to speak to the media, not to discuss any details of his service, and to consider himself bound by the Official Secrets Act for the remainder of his life. The words washed over him like a wave, drowning him in their finality. His career was over, his reputation destroyed, and the worst part was knowing that he was innocent. The walk through the palace corridors felt like a march to execution. 2 junior security officers flanked James, their faces carefully blank. These were men he had trained, mentored during their early days on the force. Now they could barely look at him. The shame of it burned hotter than any anger. Not shame for what he had allegedly done, but shame at being treated as guilty without a real chance to defend himself. His locker was in the guards' quarters, a small space that had been his home away from home for over a decade. Photos of his mother were pinned inside the door. A small medal he had received for exemplary service sat on the top shelf. A spare uniform hung neatly pressed and ready. These objects, which had once represented pride and achievement, now seemed like relics from someone else's life. He gathered them mechanically, his hands moving while his mind remained numb with shock. Other guards watched from doorways and corners as he packed his belongings into a plain cardboard box. Word had spread quickly through the palace grapevine. Whispers followed him. Some faces showed sympathy. Others displayed suspicion or even contempt. The unity they had once shared was fractured, replaced by the uncomfortable reality that one of their own had fallen from grace. Trust, once broken, could never be fully restored within such a tight-knit community. The moment came to surrender his credentials. James removed the identification badge that had granted him access to one of the most secure locations in the world. His fingers trembled as he unclipped it from his uniform. This small piece of plastic represented everything he had worked for, every sacrifice he had made. Handing it over to Commander Stone felt like surrendering a piece of his identity. Without it, he was no longer James Mitchell, Royal Guard. He was just James Mitchell, unemployed and disgraced. Queen Camilla had remained in the security office, observing the proceedings from a distance. Protocol required her presence to ensure the dismissal was handled properly, that there were witnesses to every step. She maintained her composure, but something in her posture suggested the weight of this decision. Firing a loyal servant was never easy, even when circumstances seemed to demand it. The monarchy depended on such difficult choices to maintain its standards and security. As James turned to leave, clutching his box of personal belongings, his legs suddenly gave out. The accumulated stress, the shock, the unfairness of it all crashed over him like a tidal wave. He dropped to his knees in the corridor, the box falling from his hands, its contents spilling across the polished floor, photos scattered. His medal rolled away, and for the first time since the ordeal began, his carefully maintained composure shattered completely. Tears came without warning, streaming down his face. Not quiet tears, but deep, racking sobs that shook his entire body. 12 years of service, 12 years of sacrifice, 12 years of unwavering dedication, all destroyed by accusations he could not disprove. The injustice of it was overwhelming. He had given everything to this institution. and it had cast him aside without hesitation, without truly hearing his side, without giving him a real chance to clear his name. The two escorts stood frozen, uncertain how to handle this display of raw emotion. Their training had prepared them for physical threats, for security breaches, for protocol violations. But it had not prepared them for witnessing a colleague's complete breakdown. One of them, a young officer named David who James had personally recommended for promotion, looked away, his own eyes glistening with suppressed emotion. Through his tears, James began to speak, his words tumbling out in a desperate rush. He spoke of his mother, who had been so proud when he joined the Royal Guard. She kept newspaper clippings of every public event he had worked, displaying them in her small apartment like trophies. How could he face her now? How could he explain that her son had been branded a traitor, dismissed in disgrace? The thought of breaking her heart was almost more than he could bear. He spoke of his father, who had died 5 years earlier, never having seen his son achieve his ultimate dream. James had worn his dress uniform to the funeral, standing at attention beside the casket, honoring the man who had encouraged those seemingly impossible ambitions. Now that uniform would be stripped away, that honor revoked. His father's legacy felt tarnished by association with his son's supposed betrayal. From her position in the security office, Queen Camilla could hear the commotion in the corridor. She moved to the doorway, her expression carefully controlled. What she saw gave her pause. This was not the reaction of a guilty man trying to save face. This was genuine anguish, the kind of pain that came from profound injustice. She had seen many people in distress during her years of public service, and she had developed an instinct for distinguishing between performed emotion and authentic suffering. James looked up, his face wet with tears, and his eyes met the Queen's. In that moment, something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding. His next words came out in a broken whisper that somehow carried through the corridor's silence. He swore on his father's grave that he was innocent. He had never betrayed his oath. He had never taken money for information. Someone had set him up and he did not know why or how, but he begged them to believe him, to investigate further, to not let his name be destroyed by lies. The raw honesty in his voice created ripples of doubt among the onlookers. Commander Stone shifted uncomfortably. The escorts exchanged uncertain glances. Even staff members who had maintained their distance began to wonder if perhaps there was more to this story than the evidence suggested. Queen Camilla stood very still, her hand resting against the doorframe, her expression unreadable. The absolute certainty that had driven this dismissal suddenly felt less absolute. Something about this moment demanded attention, demanded reconsideration. The tears of a loyal servant had accomplished what words and protests could not. They had planted seeds of doubt in soil that had seemed too hard to cultivate. Queen Camilla raised her hand, a small gesture that commanded immediate attention. The corridor fell silent except for James's ragged breathing. She spoke quietly to Commander Stone, her words inaudible to those at a distance. The commander's expression shifted from certainty to confusion, then to something approaching concern. He nodded slowly and turned to address the gathered staff. The dismissal would proceed as planned, Stone announced, but there would be a secondary review of the evidence. It was highly unusual, this concession, and it spoke to the Queen's willingness to question even decisions that seemed beyond doubt. James remained on his knees, too exhausted to stand, too emotionally drained to feel hope. But around him, the atmosphere had shifted subtly. The absolute condemnation had been replaced by uncertainty, by the possibility that justice might yet prevail. David, the young escort, finally moved to help James to his feet. His touch was gentle, supportive rather than restraining. Together they gathered the scattered belongings, placing them back in the box with care. The metal was retrieved from where it had rolled, its surface scratched but still recognizable. These small acts of kindness, after the harshness of the formal proceedings, felt like lifelines thrown to a drowning man. As James was escorted toward the exit, Queen Camilla did something unprecedented. She followed at a discreet distance, maintaining the formal separation required by protocol, yet clearly invested in this man's fate in a way that went beyond mere institutional responsibility. Her staff noticed this deviation from standard procedure, exchanging glances that spoke volumes about the significance of her actions. The Queen did not involve herself in personnel matters at this level. Her presence suggested something deeper was at work. Outside in the staff courtyard, James paused to breathe the cool autumn air. His red uniform, which he would soon have to surrender, felt heavy with symbolism. He had worn it with pride for 12 years, through rain and snow, through ceremonies and crises. Now it would be folded and stored, perhaps to be worn by someone else, as if his service had never mattered. The impermanence of it all struck him with renewed force. A memory surfaced, sharp and painful. 3 years earlier, James had been on duty during a security scare. An unidentified package had been discovered near the Queen's route to an official engagement. While others hesitated, James had been the first to approach to assess the threat. It had turned out to be harmless, a gift from an admirer left in the wrong place. But his willingness to put himself at risk had been noted, commended. Queen Camilla had personally thanked him afterward, a brief encounter that had meant everything to him. Did she remember that incident now? Did it matter in the face of the current accusations? The review that had been promised could take weeks, even months. In the meantime, James would be without income, without purpose, without the structure that had defined his adult life. He had modest savings, enough for perhaps 2 months if he was careful. His mother's care home fees would consume most of that. The financial pressure was immense, but it paled in comparison to the emotional toll. How did one prove innocence when all the evidence seemed to point toward guilt? Queen Camilla watched from a palace window as James was led to the gates. Something about his broken figure troubled her deeply. She had made difficult decisions throughout her years of public service, choices that prioritized security and protocol over individual comfort. But this felt different. The evidence had been convincing, the need for swift action clear. Yet his reaction, his tears, his passionate declaration of innocence, all suggested a truth that did not align with the official narrative. She summoned her private secretary, a woman who had served her for over a decade and whose judgment she trusted implicitly. Together they reviewed the case file, looking for inconsistencies, for details that might have been overlooked in the rush to respond to a serious breach. The bank transfer was documented, indisputable. But the timing was odd. The money had appeared 2 days before the incident, too soon for someone planning such a careful operation. It suggested advance payment, but it also created a paper trail that any competent conspirator would have avoided. The surveillance malfunction was another anomaly. Technical failures happened, certainly, but the precision of this one, occurring at exactly the right moment to eliminate evidence, seemed almost too convenient. The palace had experienced security issues before, but never with such perfectly timed technical problems. It raised questions about whether the malfunction had been natural or engineered by someone with access to the systems. Queen Camilla requested James's complete service record. What she found there painted a picture of exemplary dedication. Commendations for bravery, perfect attendance, multiple instances where he had gone beyond his duty to ensure the safety of the royal family. His financial records, beyond the suspicious transfer, showed a man living modestly, supporting his widowed mother, with no signs of the lifestyle that £20,000 might provide. Someone living beyond their means might be susceptible to bribery. But James's life showed no such vulnerability. The private secretary pointed out another detail. James had been scheduled to take leave during the week of the incident. His mother's birthday was approaching, and he had requested time off to visit her. But a colleague had called in sick, and James had volunteered to cover the shift. It was not supposed to be his responsibility that evening. The person who should have been on duty was a guard named Martin Clark, someone with less seniority, but an otherwise unremarkable record. Why would someone planning to facilitate a security breach volunteer for an unscheduled shift? These threads of doubt began to weave into something larger, a pattern that suggested an alternative narrative. Queen Camilla felt a growing unease. What if they had dismissed an innocent man? What if the real culprit was still out there, perhaps celebrating their success in framing someone else? The implications were disturbing, not just for James, but for the integrity of the entire security apparatus. She made a decision then, one that would require political capital and personal involvement. The review would not be a mere formality. It would be thorough, aggressive, and she would personally ensure it received the resources and attention it deserved. Justice, she believed, was not negotiable, even when it was inconvenient. The investigation that Queen Camilla ordered was unlike the first. Instead of rushing to conclusions, the team dug deeper, questioning assumptions that had seemed solid. They interviewed everyone who had been on duty that evening, not just those in James's immediate vicinity. They examined financial records for all personnel with access to the compromised area. They brought in outside experts to analyze the surveillance system malfunction. What emerged was a picture far more complex than anyone had anticipated. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A junior IT technician, reviewing system logs as part of the technical investigation, discovered something odd. The surveillance malfunction had been triggered remotely, using administrator credentials that should have been restricted to a very small group. Further analysis revealed that those credentials had been accessed from a terminal in the security office itself, during a time when Martin Clark, the guard who had called in sick, had been logged into the system hours before his shift was supposed to begin. When investigators pulled Clark's complete file, additional red flags emerged. He had significant gambling debts that he had successfully hidden through careful manipulation of his financial records. The debts had been accumulating for months, reaching a crisis point just weeks before the security breach. Phone records showed multiple calls to a number traced back to a known tabloid journalist with a reputation for paying sources. The pattern was damning. Clark had orchestrated an elaborate frame. He had made himself unavailable for his scheduled shift, knowing that James, with his reputation for reliability, would likely volunteer to cover. He had compromised the surveillance system in advance, ensuring there would be no video evidence. The money deposited into James's account had been transferred using stolen banking credentials, creating a false trail. Clark had even gained access to the door codes through his position, allowing the photographer entry during the brief window when James was conducting his routine patrol of adjacent areas. The scope of the deception was staggering. Clark had counted on the palace's need for swift, decisive action to prevent a thorough investigation. He had gambled that circumstantial evidence against James would be enough to ensure his dismissal, deflecting attention from the real culprit. It had nearly worked. Without Queen Camilla's intervention, without her willingness to question the initial findings, justice would have been a casualty of expedience. Martin Clark was arrested quietly, without media fanfare. The palace wanted to avoid any publicity that might encourage others to attempt similar schemes. His confession, when it came, was complete. He detailed how he had planned the operation for weeks, how he had selected James as the perfect fall guy because of his clean record and his position during that critical shift. The gambling debts had driven him to desperation, and desperation had made him capable of betraying both his colleague and his oath. James learned of these developments through a phone call from Commander Stone. The apology was awkward, formal, inadequate for the magnitude of the injustice, but Stone was genuinely contrite. He had failed to conduct a thorough enough investigation initially, had allowed pressure for quick results to compromise proper procedure. The palace would restore James's position, with back pay and a formal acknowledgement that he had been wrongly accused. It was as close to reparation as an institution could offer. James felt numb as he absorbed this information, relief mixed with anger, vindication tangled with bitterness. 3 weeks had passed since his dismissal. 3 weeks of unemployment, of shame, of trying to explain to his mother why he no longer wore his uniform. 3 weeks of questioning himself, wondering if perhaps there was something he had missed, some mistake he had made that had led to this nightmare. Now he knew the truth, but the knowledge did not erase the trauma. Queen Camilla requested a private meeting. It was another breach of standard protocol, another indication that this situation had transcended normal institutional boundaries. James arrived at the palace wearing civilian clothes, feeling strange and vulnerable without his uniform. He was escorted not to the security office, but to a smaller, more intimate receiving room used for personal rather than official business. The setting itself suggested the nature of what was to come. The Queen stood as he entered, a gesture of respect that caught him off guard. She was not in formal attire, but dressed simply, as if she too wanted to strip away the layers of ceremony that usually defined their interactions. She began by apologizing, not with the formal language of institutional regret, but with personal words that acknowledged the specific harm done to him.
She had failed him, she said.
The system had failed him, and while that failure had been corrected, it could not undo the suffering he had endured. James found himself crying again, But these tears were different. They were tears of release, of validation, of being truly seen and heard by someone who wielded immense power and yet chose to acknowledge their fallibility. He told her about the 3 weeks, about his mother's confusion and distress, about the neighbors who had stopped speaking to him, about the nights when he questioned whether he had the strength to continue. The Queen listened without interruption, her own eyes glistening with unshed tears. She explained why she had insisted on the second investigation. His reaction during the dismissal had troubled her deeply. In her years of public service, she had witnessed many emotional displays, some genuine, some calculated for effect. But his had been different. It had been the raw grief of a man whose identity had been stripped away unjustly. She could not ignore that grief, could not let it go unexamined. Her instinct had told her something was wrong, and she had learned to trust those instincts even when they contradicted seemingly solid evidence. James asked if he could return to service. The question surprised even him. After everything that had happened, part of him wanted to walk away, to find a new career where the stakes were lower and the betrayals less personal. But a stronger part of him still believed in the mission, still felt the call to serve. The Queen smiled, the first genuine smile he had seen from her. His position would be waiting, she assured him. More than that, she wanted him to take on a new role in training and oversight, using his experience to help prevent similar injustices in the future. His suffering would not be wasted. It would become a catalyst for positive change, a reminder that justice required vigilance and the courage to question even the most convincing narratives. 6 months later, James stood once again in the palace courtyard, but everything had changed. He wore his red uniform with renewed pride, though it now carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. The young recruits he was training looked at him with respect that went beyond his rank. They knew his story, how he had been wrongly accused and ultimately vindicated. He had become a symbol of resilience, of the importance of thorough investigation, of never accepting convenient narratives when truth demanded deeper examination. His new role involved reviewing security protocols and conducting training sessions on both procedural compliance and ethical decision-making. He taught recruits about the importance of documentation, of questioning anomalies, of maintaining personal financial integrity. But more importantly, he taught them about the human cost of rushing to judgment, about how lives could be destroyed by assumptions and circumstantial evidence. His lessons carried authority because they came from lived experience, from having survived the very nightmare he warned others about. The palace had implemented new safeguards in response to the incident. Security credentials now required biometric verification. Financial disclosure requirements for all personnel had been strengthened. The surveillance system had been overhauled with redundancies to prevent future tampering. Most significantly, there was now a mandatory review period for any termination related to security breaches, ensuring that no one could be dismissed without thorough investigation and multiple levels of oversight. James's relationship with Commander Stone had evolved into something more complex than it had been before. There was a wariness now, an acknowledgement of the fragility of trust. But there was also a deeper respect, earned through the difficult process of admitting mistakes and making amends. Stone had personally overseen James's return to service, ensuring his reintegration was smooth and that no stigma attached to his record. The commander had learned his own lessons about the dangers of certainty and the necessity of doubt. James's mother had been overjoyed by his vindication. She had never doubted her son's innocence, had defended him fiercely to neighbors and friends who whispered about the scandal. When James showed her the official letter of apology from the palace, she had cried with relief. Her health had suffered during those 3 weeks of uncertainty, and James felt guilt about the toll his ordeal had taken on her. But she insisted she would not trade the eventual triumph for an easier path. Character, she said, was revealed in adversity, and her son had proven his character beyond any doubt. Queen Camilla had kept her distance after their private meeting, allowing James space to rebuild his life without the awkwardness of continued royal attention. But she had not forgotten him. When a major charity event required extra security coordination, she specifically requested that James be included in the planning. It was a gesture of trust, a public demonstration that she had complete confidence in his abilities and integrity. The press noticed, though they did not know the full story behind the assignment. The incident had changed James in ways both obvious and subtle. He was less naive about institutional justice now, more aware of how quickly reputations could be destroyed and how difficult they were to rebuild. He had learned that doing one's job well was not always enough protection against false accusations. But he had also learned about the power of persistence, about the importance of allies who would question official narratives, about the redemptive potential of admitting mistakes and making genuine amends. David, the young officer who had shown him kindness during his lowest moment, had become something of a protege. James mentored him carefully, teaching not just procedures but philosophy. He emphasized the importance of treating every person with dignity, especially those who were vulnerable or accused. He taught that true security came not just from following protocols, but from creating systems where justice and efficiency could coexist. David absorbed these lessons eagerly, seeing in James a model of the kind of leader he wanted to become. On the anniversary of his reinstatement, James received an unexpected invitation. Queen Camilla was hosting a small private ceremony to honor those who had contributed to improving palace security protocols. James was to receive a commendation, not for his years of service, though those were certainly valuable, but specifically for his role in catalyzing positive institutional change. His wrongful dismissal and subsequent vindication had exposed weaknesses in the system that might otherwise have remained hidden until another innocent person was hurt. The ceremony was intimate, attended only by senior security personnel and a few members of the royal household. Queen Camilla spoke about the importance of learning from mistakes, about how institutions that could not acknowledge and correct errors lost their legitimacy. She spoke about James specifically, praising his resilience and his willingness to return to service despite having every reason to walk away. She thanked him not just for his continued dedication, but for reminding everyone present that behind every security breach, every protocol violation, every accusation, there were human beings whose lives hung in the balance. When James stepped forward to receive his commendation, he found himself once again fighting back tears. But these were tears of gratitude, of closure, of having traveled through darkness and emerged into light. He thought of his father, wishing he could have been there to see this moment. He thought of his mother, who would display this new honor alongside the old newspaper clippings. He thought of the 3 weeks when his world had collapsed, and how that collapse had somehow led to something stronger being built in its place. In his acceptance speech, James spoke about forgiveness and forward movement. He acknowledged the pain of the experience, but also the unexpected gifts it had brought. He had discovered reserves of strength he had not known he possessed. He had learned the value of allies who would stand by truth even when it was inconvenient. He had witnessed an institution, often criticized for being rigid and hierarchical, demonstrate the capacity for self-correction and genuine accountability. Most importantly, he had learned that justice, while sometimes delayed, was worth fighting for and believing in. As the ceremony concluded, Queen Camilla approached James privately. She told him that his tears, that day in the corridor when his world was falling apart, had saved him. They had been authentic in a way that could not be faked, had revealed a truth that evidence could not capture. She had learned something important that day about the limitations of institutional certainty and the necessity of human intuition. Sometimes, she said, the most important security measure was the willingness to question our own conclusions. James thanked her, understanding that this conversation represented the true completion of his journey. He had not just been vindicated. He had been seen, heard, and valued as a human being rather than merely as a security resource. That recognition, more than any formal commendation, represented the restoration of his dignity and the validation of his worth. His story would live on in the palace, told to new recruits as a reminder that justice required both strength and compassion, both procedure and humanity, both certainty and the courage to doubt.